so much, Maggie, for that very generous introduction. I'd like to thank the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, the Armenian Foundation, and of course, all of you for taking your time to be here. So, I will give a talk for approximately 45 to 50 minutes, and I hope that it'll be worth, and I will make it worth your time to be here. My work predominantly deals with a tiny community of Armenian silk merchants, originally residing in a small town, mercantile town, on the borders of the Safavid Empire of Iran and the Ottoman Empire, neighboring Ottoman Empire, a town known as Old Juffa, whose inhabitants were forcibly displaced and resettled in the course of the Ottoman Safavid wars of the early part of the 17th century, and who were particularly targeted for relocation and resettlement by the Safavid monarch Shah Abbas I, who essentially deported about 300,000 or 400,000 Armenians from the bordering regions of Iran and what is today Turkey, and resettled many of them in his own empire known as the Safavid Empire in Iraq. The small community of Armenian silk merchants residing in Old Juffa were given relatively privileged treatment. They were sent and resettled on the outskirts of the new imperial capital of Safavid Iran, known as Isfahan, where they established a thriving commercial colony known as New Juffa in memory of the old town. Now, within a very short period of their deportations from their original town of Old Juffa, these merchants came to accomplish a remarkable feat. They came to preside over one of the greatest trade networks of the early modern period. And by the early modern period, as a world historian, I mean to say the period that roughly falls between 1500 and 1800. So they accomplished this remarkable feat of coming to preside over one of the greatest trade networks of the early modern period, with trade settlements that spanned from London, Amsterdam, and Cadiz in the west, all across the Mediterranean, Europe, Russia, West Asia, Mughal India, and as far east as Canton, China, and Manila, the Philippines. Some of the members of this trade network were not satisfied with reaching Manila, and the more intrepid ones at least made the long journey across the Pacific to establish small beachheads in Acapulco and Mexico City. All of this in the early 1700s. So 300 years ago, this is before the age of the internet, before the age of jet airplanes and so on. My book, of course, is a detailed study of the social, economic, and religious institutions that underpinned and sustained this global network of settlements of the Juffan merchants, and in particular pays attention to a number of economic institutions and contracts that these merchants relied upon to conduct their long-distance trade. And of course, I hope you will forgive me for being a little selfish here. Since I study merchants, I trust that it is okay for me to push my book and to encourage you to follow Maggie's advice earlier on and to purchase copies. And I will be more than happy to sign the copies for you. So what I will do today, in the 40 minutes or so that remains, is to provide a brief and concise outline of some of the major themes that I raised in the book, and particularly to focus on the nature and structure of the Juffan Global Trade Network, and then to say a few words about the importance of one type of long-distance partnership contract that these merchants employed in order to expand their network on a global scale. The person who first introduced the art of calico printing in Europe to Marseille in particular was a Juffan. There was actually two Juffans who owned the first calico workshop in Marseille. The same can be said for Juffans in Livorno and Juffans possibly in Amsterdam. In the opposite direction of technology flows, the introduction of printing into Iran, I wouldn't say the first printing press as is sometimes claimed, but the introduction of the first, let's say, printing press that continuously operated and produced, actually published in printed books, was again via the Julfan trade network. The Julfans opened a printing press in Julfa in 1636. That's actually quite early in terms of the history of printing in the East. And I could go on, but I think these two examples suffice. So essentially, so far I've given you one response to the so what question. They're very important for world historians, not just for Armenians, because of their role as go-betweens and because of the fact that they operated across a large swath of the territory of the early modern world, not just Asia or not just Iran or Armenia and so on, but the early modern world as a whole. The second reason why they're important is because, again, they are arguably the only Eurasian community of merchants to have left behind a very rich and dizzying paper trail of documentation that essentially runs from London eastwards until Mexico City. Now this is important because most scholars of the Indian Ocean world, among which I count myself to be, usually tell you that if they want to study an Asian or Eurasian community of merchants, they are compelled to rely excessively on European documentation produced by the East India companies that were doing business in the Indian Ocean during this period. And of course, for most scholars, this is somewhat problematic because in order to write Asian history, some of these scholars are relying on European documentation, which I think sometimes produces rather skewed results. So, and when you question some of these scholars as to why they haven't relied on indigenous language documentation, they say, well, we don't have any documentation because everybody knows that none of the Asian or Eurasian communities left behind a rich paper trail of documentation that one finds, for instance, in the East India Company cases. So to this I say, the Julfans are actually, again, an exception here. We have anywhere from, at the very least, 10,000 to possibly as many as 25,000 pieces, discrete pieces of documentation, most of which are in complete form. And majority of which, without, at the risk of, I don't want to toot my own horn, but during my research I worked in 31 archives from London to Mexico City, and in the process I essentially discovered over 10,000 pieces of documentation, and of course I relied upon them, and without them I would not have been able to have written this book. And so in this sense as well, one of the arguments I have in my book is that Julfan documentation is not only of interest to Armenians or to Julfans or to historians or scholars of Julfa, it's actually of interest to world historians. If you want to write a social and economic history of the Indian Ocean, and you don't want to rely excessively on European company documentation, you have local indigenous documentation, in this case written in Julfa dialect, which is a peculiar dialect used almost exclusively by the merchants from Old and New Julfa. It's a dialect that in its mercantile form is no longer spoken or written, it's extinct, so it is very difficult to actually read the documents written in this dialect. Now I'll get back to the question of the so what from another angle, this time not a world history angle, which is the angle that I've adopted in my book, but from the angle of, let's say, Armenian history. And towards the conclusion of my talk, I'll give you at least two reasons why the Julfans are also of interest to Armenians from a perspective of Armenian history. But now, and of course this is the cover of my book. This is advertising on my part so that you may be interested in walking down to the table later on and perhaps purchasing a copy or two as a gift as well. But initially I raised the question of the remarkable trade network that the Julfans had come to preside over shortly after their deportations. Now I mentioned that this network expanded outwards into multiple directions, and essentially we can say that within like 50 years or even less of their forced deportations from Old Julfa resettlement on the outskirts of Isfahan in New Julfa, what became known as New Julfa. During this period, and especially after the Julfans were given the support and patronage of the Safavid state, particularly under the rule of the Safavid monarch Shah Abbas I, without which they would not have been able to have achieved the accomplishments that they did. But during this period, the Jufans expanded outwards essentially in a fishbone-like dispersion into 3 or 4 different areas, coming to form 4, at the very least, 4, what I call 4 interlocking circuits of trade, all of which were connected to each other, and especially to their nodal center, to the center of their entire network in New Jufa itself. The first circuit, and arguably the most important circuit, was the circuit for the large part based in the Indian Ocean and with Mughal India or South Asia as its center. And I'll go quickly through these circuits. This is the Indian Ocean circuit that I just mentioned. As you will see, this is New Jufa here, next to Isfahan, established in 1605, 1606. And then these are settlements that belong to the Jufan circuit of trade in the Indian Ocean. As you can see, looking at this map, the majority of these circuits, of these settlements, happens to be in the area of what is now India and Pakistan, South Asia, generally speaking, such as, of course, the settlement of Madras, very important Jufan settlement, the settlement in Calcutta up to the north, and Surat up here, as well as a number of other places. And then off the coastal maritime region of India, we have a very unusual Jufan settlement in the most unlikely of all places, in Lhasa, Tibet, where the Jufans had established a small settlement beginning in 1660 and lasting until 1770. We're not talking about very large settlements here. We're talking about, at the most, maybe a few hundred at the most. So in India, for instance, the largest settlement that they had in Madras never surpassed 280 people by the 1770s. Some scholars have claimed that there were 20,000 Armenians who set foot at one point or another from 1500 to 1800. But I suppose the more important question will be, perhaps 20,000 did set foot, but how many of them actually settled them? And there, the numbers are much lower than what has traditionally been claimed. But in any case, you will notice that in addition to India, we have Jufan settlements in Southeast Asia, in what is today Burma, Myanmar, Southeast Asia right here as well, in Indonesia and Malaysia, as well as on the very outer fringes of the Indian Ocean world, in Manila, the Philippines here, with which I will return in a second. And then Canton, China was a very important small Jufan settlement as well. But one thing that all of these settlements shared in common is something that I've tried to outline here in the form of the arrows here, the darker red arrows and the lighter arrows. And these arrows are essentially, these arrows represent what is known as the monsoon pattern of winds in the Indian Ocean. Now, with the monsoon pattern, what I mean to say is essentially that for 6 months of the year, in the Indian Ocean, the wind blows in one direction. So sometime anywhere between December and March, the winds blow in a westerly direction. In the other 6 months, the wind blows in the opposite direction. So what does this mean, and why is this important for an explanation as to why the Jufans established so many settlements in the Indian Ocean arena? Why did they even need one settlement? They could have stayed in New Jufa and sent out representatives to do business for them. But the reason they needed settlements has to do with the monsoon season, the monsoonal pattern of the Indian Ocean. Some commodities that he wants to take to India to sell on behalf of his master living in New Jufa. Or he has some money to purchase commodities. Let's say he has $100,000 given to him to purchase commodities. He arrives in the 1650s, let's say. He arrives in Surat, and a very important textile center, as well as in the south. Let's say most of these Indian settlements were very important for Indian textiles, as well as spices, and later on, particularly for diamonds and gems. So he arrives in Calcutta, Madras. He has a certain amount of capital with him to invest and purchase local South Asian commodities to take back with him to Isfahan to sell at, of course, at a higher rate of profit. Now, most local merchants would know that this Hagok, or whatever his name is, from Jufa, has arrived on a ship. Everybody had to travel by a sailboat. He has arrived in Calcutta, and the local merchants know that that person would have to leave at a certain time of the year if he didn't want to risk being stuck in Calcutta for a whole year. So if you missed the monsoon season, you're basically stuck for a whole year waiting for the wind pattern to shift so you could board ship and return back to Juffa. So of course, with this knowledge in mind, the local merchants could very easily wait until the very last weeks before the monsoon season literally closed, until the merchant was forced to cough up all the money that they were asking for his commodity. So, of course, this kind of structure stimulated and encouraged all the merchants of the Indian Ocean, especially the Jofis, to at one point or another to think about establishing little settlements so that they would have members of their own community residing there, so that they wouldn't be blackmailed by, let's say, local merchants waiting until the very last day before the monsoon season closed so that they could jack up the prices of whatever commodity they had to sell or lower the prices of the commodity that they wanted to purchase. So as a result, this kind of encouraged the proliferation of settlements across the Indian Ocean world. The second circuit is the circuit north of Juffa, this time across Muscovite Russia, where we have settlements in Astrakhan, Kazan, Moscow, Archangel, Arkhangelsk, St. Petersburg, and so on. And this quadrant here, this circuit here, was important to the Jufans because it served them as a springboard to establish settlements in the fourth circuit in northwestern Europe, including Amsterdam, London, and Paris. And then we also have the circuit to the west of Juffa in the Mediterranean world, which includes settlements in Aleppo, which is on the coast, I mean not literally on the coast, but near the port town of Iskenderun, Alexandretta. And of course Izmir, Smyrna, Constantinople, Istanbul, even in Split, Balaton, and today's Croatia, there was a presence of Jufans, and of course in my favorite city in the galaxy, Venice, Italy, as well as Livorno as well. So wherever there were a significant number of Jufans, they had not only their own members residing there, but they had a printing press and a school, if the numbers justified it, and if the local conditions allowed them to have, let's say, a church. And then lastly, this is the last circuit, again across the Mediterranean. We have a settlement here in Cadiz, Spain, in the 1680s, Paris, 1660s, Marseille, 1620 onwards, Genoa, Livorno, Venice, London, 1680s, Amsterdam, 1620s. Now, all of these settlements, again, I don't want to give you the wrong impression, they were not bustling communities with thousands of residents. We're talking about very small, tiny communities of maybe 100 residents at the most. No single settlement in Europe surpassed 100. No Armenian single settlement in Europe surpassed 100 people during the period that I covered, 1500 to 1800. Venice, for instance, sometimes when you read books on Armenians in Venice, like I did, you get the impression that 1 out of every 3 persons in Venice was an Armenian, or that there were thousands of Armenians in Venice. The reality is that according to census results, which I have actually the documents from the archives, the Armenians in Venice never surpassed 80 individuals in 1749. At the most, perhaps, Jaiti, maybe 100, 110 perhaps. But we're talking about very small settlements. And this, of course, makes their accomplishments even more remarkable because despite their very small numbers, as we shall see, they went on to accomplish quite remarkable feats. Documents from Mexico City that I examined that belong to the Inquisition documents. The Spanish Inquisition, of course, had offices all over the world, and including Manila itself, where, of course, Manila being a Spanish colonial outpost, officially was a Catholic outpost. And of course, if you were an Armenian Christian, you would be regarded as a schismatic or a heretic, perhaps, from the perspective of the Catholic Church. So these Jofans used to arrive in Manila. Of course, their principal concern in life was to expand their profit. They were extremely stingy and they did whatever it took to amass the profits that they had. So, and this meant, of course, that if they had to convert to other religions, they did so. And we don't have large-scale conversions, but we do have a number of conversions in multiple directions, particularly to Catholicism, but also to Islam and so on. In the case of one Jufan merchant, we have a case of one too many conversion. A case of a merchant who was known under 5 or 6 different names, including Hoja Philippos in his original name, as well as Comte de Syrie, which was the name he adopted after he converted to Catholicism, and later on also known as Hussein Beg Talish, when he converted to Shiism. But his main mistake was to convert to Shiism and then Sunnism, of course, for which he was hanged in Yerevan in the 1690s or early 1700s. But his counterparts also did the same in regards to Catholicism. So some of these Jufan merchants who arrived in Manila, beginning in the 1720s, we have Inquisition records of approximately 20 to maybe 30 or 40 Jufans who visited the Inquisition office with the intention of converting to Catholicism and of swearing left and right and cursing the Armenian Apostolic Church as a schismatic institution and telling the Inquisition officer that their entire life's dream was to convert to the only and true religion, the only true Orthodox religion, which was Catholicism. And of course, I'm reading these documents, and most of the time, you know that they're very clever. They would say anything to convert, and many of them did convert in this fashion to prolong and enhance their chances of success and prosperity in Manila. And one of the most interesting things about the Inquisition documents is that the Inquisition officer would actually pose the most appropriate questions from the historian's perspective to these Jofans. So there was a formulaic set of questions that the Inquisition officer would administer to all people, to everyone who came to the office to convert, and the questions included questions such as, where were you born? What religion did your parents belong to? What was their name? When were you born there? When did you leave your hometown? How many places have you visited in your life? How long have you stayed at each place? And when did you arrive at our beautiful city of Manila? And what are your future plans? Of course, every historian would dream of having these kinds of questions administered to people in the past, because they allow us to actually write history. In addition to that, the Inquisition officer also asked, one of his last questions was, what is the general level of your education? Right? Ideal questions. So to these questions, 2 individuals gave responses, very lengthy responses that really, really stand out for their remarkable globetrotting nature of their travels. And these individuals are Santiago de Baraquiel and Gregorio de Zacarias. Neither of them sound like Armenian names, but they're both Jofans. And in the case of Santiago de Baraquiel, in the 1720s, he shows up in the Inquisition office in Manila. He's very young, he's probably in his late teens, maybe early 20s, and he describes his travels to the Inquisition officer. And in his within a period of 20 years or so of his travels as a factor or agent to a richer merchant residing in Jufa, which I will get to in a second in terms of the mechanism of the contract that allowed Santiago to travel this far. Santiago basically, in the 20 years that he traveled for his merchant master, covered and encompassed all 4 circuits of the Jufan global network, including, of course, the Indian Ocean circuit, the Northern Russian circuit, Northwestern European circuit, as well as the Mediterranean circuit. He was literate. He had been educated in the language of his hometown, which is the Jufa dialect. He had gone to business school. They had a business school in Jufa in the 1660s or 70s, almost like a precursor to a modern-day MBA program, where the young students were taught the art of long-distance trade, what kind of commodities to purchase, where and when, and so on. And we have 2 surviving textbooks from this business school. And one of my projects in the next 5 years is to actually produce a translation of one of these textbooks, which is one of the more important sources for the history of the early modern Indian Ocean. In any case, so Santiago had gone to school at this MBA school. He was literate in his language. He had become extremely proficient, or even an expert in math, because they taught complex mathematics at this school. And he had also acquired a number of foreign languages, including, of course, Spanish. They also taught languages in Jufa, and Dutch. when he arrived in Manila, he told the Inquisition officer that he had become also proficient in double entry bookkeeping in Spanish. So, and we can see that at the age of 13 he leaves Isfahan Jufa, he goes north initially, across Russia, and then at some point he backtracks, he goes back to Jufa, marries a local bride, probably stays there for another year, he creates some progeny, children, and then he takes off, like many of these merchants, for 20 years, 30 years. And then eventually some of them are outside, some of them are in the field literally for 30 years, working on behalf of a master, of a wealthy capitalist master residing in Jufa. So, but many of them actually work in little brief stints visiting New Jufa and marrying local brides from there before they actually embark on long journeys. And of course, naturally, another question that arises is, what did these merchants do? They were away for 30 years. You would assume that at some point or another, the instinctual economy would somehow kick in, that they would have wives in many different ports and so on, and they would creolize as they traveled, which they actually did. We don't have many documents about this because the Armenian documents don't really bear this out, but we know from foreign sources, let's say French accounts from the same period, that many of these agents like Santiago did marry outside the community on a fairly frequent basis. They were away for 30 years after all. In any case, I will come back to this in a second, but let us now briefly talk about what made it possible for the Jofans to maintain the ethno-religious integrity of this larger global network of settlements. Why is it that the Jofan network actually managed to survive more or less intact for over 100 years? Was there some kind of secret to their success and to their ability to keep this network more or less in one piece? And to answer this question, I basically relied on the work of this historian in Paris by the name of Claude Markovitz, who has a very interesting definition and reconceptualization of the concept of trade network. And basically, Markovitz argues that a trade network consists of what he calls a network center, which is what I call in my book a nodal center, in this case New Jufa, and then a series of nodes or settlements scattered around the center. In that these nodes or settlements around the center, according to Markovitz, have to be connected to each other and to the center through what he calls the circulation of men and things. In this case, what he's talking about and what I actually extensively discuss in my book is the circulation of, first and foremost, merchants, in this case men, 99.9%, in fact 100% of all the merchants, like Santiago, who traveled and invested money on behalf of their wealthy merchants back in Isfahan, were men. So merchants and credit would be the first and most important object that circulated across the Jufa network. Secondly, we have the circulation of women, although in this case we have very few women who actually did circulate, and the evidence that we have suggests that those women who did circulate did so as, let's say, wives to their husbands or mothers to their children. One would assume that there were enough women for the community to reproduce itself, but we don't have that much evidence as to how these women actually traveled. For the most part, we would assume they traveled with their husbands or there are no examples of women being sent from New Jufa, let's say, as brides to future husbands. And then we have the case of priests, and this is a very important aspect of the circulation of the Jufa network, which is missing in the work of my colleague Claude Markovitz. And by priests, I mean that the center of the Jofan network, well, let's put it this way. Jufa, I should have said, was not just a mercantile network. It was also a religious network. It was a network that had its own diocesan center, which was basically housed right here in the Sur Amina Pargich Vank, the All Saviors Monastery in New Jufa itself. Now, when you take a look at this picture, what's the first thing that crosses your mind? It doesn't look like your average church, right? In fact, it looks more like a mosque. It's kind of like a mosque church. And this is an interesting thing because it's an analogy I use this as an analogy for understanding the larger world of Jufan identity, of Jufan cultural identity. Like this mosque, the Jufans borrowed from different traditions. They enriched their own cultural tradition by borrowing from the cultures of their host societies. And so, for instance, you have, and the result of this borrowing and mixture was what I call a trans-imperial cosmopolitan identity. An identity that wasn't just exclusively Armenian or Jufan, but one that was actually a hybrid, a mixture of different identities, which still nonetheless maintained its core Jufan, I suppose, self. So this kind of mixed hybrid identity manifested itself in multiple areas of Jufan life, including Jufan vocabulary itself. 60% of the vocabulary of Jufa dialect consists of foreign loanwords, such as, for instance, mostly from Ottoman Turkish, Persian, Arabic, as well as Hindustani and a sprinkle of Tibetan. We also have Russian later on, and lingua franca, Italian, French, and so on. All of this one finds in the Jufa dialect itself, and this again is an example of the richly complex and hybridized nature of the Jufan identity itself. You can also, this identity also reveals itself or manifests itself in Jufan cuisine, in Jufan sartorial customs, the dresses that they wore, turbans and so on. They essentially look very much like anybody else from the larger Islamicate world of Eurasia, which means basically not the Islamic world of Eurasia, but the Islamicate world, which means basically the world that was highly culturally influenced by Islam. So you could be an Armenian, nominally a Christian, and yet in terms of your identity, you could be Islamicate. That is to say, you could borrow cultural practices from Islam to enrich your own culture without necessarily being a Muslim yourself. And in this sense as well, the Jufans are actually quite unique. And you also have this in the commercial law of the Jufans, which for the most part, as far as we have been able to ascertain, was largely influenced by Sharia, by the Sharia. So most of Jufan commercial law can be arguably, although there is no smoking gun proof of this, but most of the evidence points in this direction. One could argue that a substantial part of Jufan commercial law was actually built on the foundations of Sharia law, and that they didn't see any kind of contradiction in borrowing whatever worked for them from neighboring cultures and civilizations. So now let me just address a couple of things about the contract that enabled Santiago de Baraquiel to travel. And this contract is known as the Comenda contract, or in the Jufan dialect, the Ingerakir or the Inkerakir, which is also known in Jufan as Muzarba, and I'll get to this in a second, the significance of this term Muzarba. But for the most part, most people know the contract as the Comenda contract, and it's a contract of long-distance partnership that involves, at the very least, two parties: a party that invests the capital, and a party that actually takes the capital and makes it work, puts it to work. And usually, you have on the one side, you have the person with the capital, the capitalist, who is referred to in the Jufan context as the Khoja or the Khwaja, as well as the Agha or Der. Usually, the party that's the associate or the Imger doesn't have the capital himself, but he has a solid education at the MBA school in Jufa. He has a spotless reputation, which was the most important commodity that the Jufans had, and he also has proficiency in a number of languages and an ability to move in and out of different cultures, which are very important skills to have during this period. And the way it worked was that the associate would receive the money, and he would go off, he would sail away from Basra usually, or the Persian Gulf, and he would be gone in an open-ended contract from anywhere from 1 or 2 years to as many as 20 or 30 years. In the case of Santiago de Baraquiel, he was gone for at the very least 20 or 30 years. I first came across an Inquisition document in 1720, and then next I came across him was in a document, this time in Jufa dialect, from Basra, the Persian Gulf, by the 1740s, where this guy, Santiago de Baraquiel, had become a fairly wealthy merchant in his own right, wealthy enough to actually loan money to the primate of New Juffa. But he had only become this wealthy because of the Komenda contract. And the basic, the way the system worked was that the associate would receive this money and would travel for up to 20 years. And then after the conclusion of his investments abroad, overseas, he would have to return to his home base in New Juffa and hand over all of his double entry accounting ledgers. He would keep a detailed ledger of every single transaction he made across multiple years. And then he would hand them over to the Khoja or the capitalist, and they would go over the transactions, one transaction at a time, and finally decide on the profit, arrive at the profit that the partnership had made for both parties. And the agreement, for the most part, was that 25% of the profit would stay with Santiago de Barranquilla. The guy who did all the work would get 25%. The Khoja, who was stationary at home in his luxurious abode in New Juffa, would receive anywhere from 75 to anywhere from 66.666% to 75%, or 1/3 to 1/4 of the capital. So it was a fairly unfair system from our perspective, because the person who did most of the work received a very small portion of the profits. But of course, from their point of view, it was an avenue to success if you didn't have the money to make it on your own during this period. And so, of course, this in itself, the fact that Juffan trade was, for the most part, by its very nature, long-distance trade, of course, brings up the whole issue of trust. If you are a wealthy capitalist, let's say you are a Khoja Minas, you're residing in your palace in New Juffa. You have $500,000, you want to put it into an investment somewhere. You want somebody for you to go out to India to purchase gems, diamonds, and so on, or textiles, and then to take it to Europe and sell it at a very high rate of profit. You wouldn't want to do all the traveling yourself. You would have to, if you couldn't hire somebody else to do it, why not? But of course, this brings up the question of trust. What makes you so sure, if you are Khoja Minas and you're stationary in New Juffa, that if you give $500,000 in cash or in credit to a lowly merchant like Santiago de Barranquilla, what makes you so sure that Santiago isn't going to take the money and run with it once he skips town? There's no way. I mean, this is a period before the internet, before Interpol, before an international legal system. So the mechanisms of controlling people were actually quite weak from our perspective. So of course, there had to be alternative ways of monitoring people and ensuring that you could actually trust them. And the Juffans solved this problem, like other merchants during this period, by using essentially two different methods, two different mechanisms. One of which is the mechanism of reputation or gossip. And the other one is co-written, and I refer to this in the book, is trust in gossip, but bastinado when needed. If Santiago wants to make sure that he is, if he wants to make sure that he is higher, if he is a profit-maximizing person, which we would think that he would be as a merchant, most merchants are very rational, and they're interested only in profit maximization, he would want to be honest, not because he fears God, or he fears he has some other moral issues, but because it's in his interest to remain honest. And why is this so? It's because if Santiago is, let's say, 19, he would think probably that he would live long enough to be 60. In which case, he would be hired by Juffan agents on multiple occasions, and if he gets hired until he's 60, he could possibly make, let's say, $3 million worth of profit. Whereas if he skips town with the $500,000, it's a one-time deal, and he will be ostracized, because if people find out about his misbehavior or the fact that he embezzled his master's money, the gossip of his act would travel from India or China all the way to Juffa, and from there would be disseminated across the network through letters and gossip networks, which I also examine in the book. So on the one hand, you have the reputation mechanism of gossip. But if that didn't work, the final way in which you could be sure that you would have high returns on your investment as a merchant in Juffa, that you could trust anybody with money, or anybody from Juffa, was that you could actually, you could take out your vengeance on their families. And this is why most Jufan Komenda agents were hired almost exclusively from Jufa. They had to be people with families in New Jufa, so that when they left town, they usually left their families, according to the Jufan law, in the care of the capitalist master, so that the master would be obliged to look after the family. The way it's presented in the commercial law is that the master is actually doing the agent a favor. He is morally, it's morally incumbent upon him to actually look after the welfare of the family. But the reality is, of course, that this is almost like a hostage-taking mechanism. So if Santiago leaves, his family stays behind. And Santiago decides that he's not going to come back. He's going to disappear with $500,000 entrusted to him. His family will pay the price. So this, of course, these two mechanisms together work to produce almost 100% returns on trust. So that in this case, in the Jufan case, trust is actually important because it reduced what economic historians refer to as transaction costs. And this is important because, to give you an example, let's take an example of a commodity exchange. Let's say Santiago this time is traveling west across the Mediterranean. Typically, he would buy one type of commodity. He would buy raw Persian silk, which was the commodity that the Jufans traded in the most. He would buy raw Persian silk. Let's say the raw Persian silk would cost, let's say in today's terms, $5. He gets a bale of raw Persian silk for $5. If he can take that raw Persian silk to Marseille, he could sell it for $200. Of course, he makes a killing on them in terms of the profit margin. But most of the money, most of the profit would be eaten up by the transportation costs of paying taxes or customs fees along the way. And then, of course, the transportation itself, the Komenda agent's own, he has to eat and so forth. But if you add to this, so if you add all the little expenses along the way, your profit margin really gets reduced. And if on top of this, if you add the possible expense for the capitalist merchant in Jufa of going to the court system, litigating, trying to get your money back from Santiago, refuses to come back, then that could cost you an additional sum. So, in theory, let's say if it costs Hojaminas $20 to get involved in a very protracted lawsuit with Santiago. That $20 would have to be taken from the profit. So, in theory, if you eliminate the litigation and you reduce your transaction cost, which means that if you have absolute return on your money in terms of trust, then you can actually outdo your competition. In the book, in the last chapter of the book, I actually compare the Jufan merchants to two other mercantile communities, and I conclude that this system of trust that they had, as irrational as it might have sounded to them, was actually a double-edged sword. It had a dark side. And the dark side was that if you only hire your own merchants from your own town, because you can only trust your own merchants, and you know that they will always come back, the problem would be that at some point in the future, if your community happens to be very small to begin with, like the Jufans, at the most 30,000 members, at some point in the future you're going to run out of agents. So you're going to reach a period of expansion, and then you're going to come to a halt. Because you can only produce so many agents through your business, and your community can only yield so many agents. So, but if you happen to be a community that does cross-cultural work, and you can collaborate and trust, let's say, outsiders, or Hindus or Catholics and so on, then in theory there's no limit to your expansion. And in the Jufan case, I think this was an important factor in this could have been an important factor in their decline, but the reality is that the community itself collapsed for other reasons, not because of the problem with their trading mechanism. It collapsed in 1747 because the center of their network was dealt a lethal blow by the post-Safavid ruler of Iran named Nadir Shah Afshar, who looted and basically destroyed New Jufa as well as Isfahan. In 1747, he had there was an incident involving burning alive at the stake of two of the most prominent members of Jufa's community, along with 2 Jews and 2 Indians. And this particular event basically caused panic in the community and led most Jufans to to leave Jufa and to move to either India, Russia, or the Mediterranean. So the Jufan collapse occurred for military and political reasons. But my hypothesis in the book is that even if they had survived, even if Nadir Shah had not existed, and even if they had not faced stiff competition in India from the English East India Company, they would have still had problems in the future because the method of trade that they adopted, based on trust, was fundamentally flawed. They could not have seen it at that point. I would have probably had the same method myself, but in the long term, it would have been problematic for them. And I will end with this, but I'll show you a couple of things first. In terms of the images, I have several thousand letters written by Jufans. These are the typical kind of envelopes that the letters were folded into, usually sealed with red wax. And here you have, for instance, the addressee entry, and it says in this case, Hasce i Christosi ham kudzial Eliasi Vorti Aga by Amena Baidzar or Boidzar, to use a Jufan term, Sahab Dovat Aga Minasi. And then in Arabic script as well, and here it says I Calcutta, so in Calcutta. In other cases it says I Calcutta or I some other place, because these merchants moved around all the time. This is a comenda contract, a partnership contract, like the one would imagine Santiago de Barakel had. This is the earliest comenda contract from 1659 that I have managed to discover in the archives, from Livon. Another comenda contract, this is a kind of what's called a tomar, which is basically a condensed summary of double entry accounting ledgers that these merchants had to keep when they traveled, which they had to hand over to the master when they returned. And the master, after going through all the expenses, would then draw up what was known as a tomar, which is basically a roll, which contains a summary of all the accounts and then the final balance sheet of the profit that they made. And some of them can be very long. They can be up to 3, 4, maybe 5 yards long. If you look at the number of firsts in the world, Armenian firsts, that can be traced to India, you will see that all of them had another, again, a Jufan connection. The first newspaper, Armenian newspaper in the world, Asarar in India, 1794 to 1796. Again, in a Jufan, on a Jufan-owned printing press, and in a Jufan community in Madras. And the first constitutional treatise, a Republican constitutional treatise for a future Republic of Armenia before there was even such a state. Again, Jufan produced, published in 1787, 1789, we don't know for sure, known as Kirk Anmanyal Vorokai Parats, which is a book called Snare of Glory, which is basically a constitution for a future Republic of Armenia, written in 1787. It's 125 or so years before there was even a state. Again, this is also of Jufan origin. And then lastly, we also have arguably the first Armenian play, first printed Armenian play in the world. Again, Calcutta, India, Jufan community. A play called The Physiognomist of Duplicity. The first, arguably the first modern Armenian novel. Again, Calcutta, India. Taghiatyans, Mesrop Taghiatyans. Although that issue is actually debatable, but strong argument can be made in that favor. And I will stop here. Welcome any questions that you have.